It seems the scab has well and truly been ripped off the sore that is rural health. Many of the 7 million Australians who live outside the big cities are sick and tired of the way they're being treated and are quite rightfully demanding action. I know their pain. 3 months ago, I reported the horrific story of my own father's death. Sadly, he was an all too familiar example of the dangers of falling ill in the country. In the weeks following, we were swamped with your stories, including many from dedicated medical professionals on the front line. They say they can no longer be expected to prop up our ailing rural health system.
I used to often wake up and think, is today going to be another day that I'm never going to forget? Often, you'd think that.
For so many on the front line of rural health in Australia, every day starts with fear and anxiety.
At the coalface now, you are completely powerless. I think they'll be going home with nightmares, thinking about what they could have done or should have done.
It's people's lives we're dealing with. It's too much to do day after day after day.
Medical staff say they're fighting a losing battle.
It's a sad state. It's like second-class citizens when it comes to healthcare for regional people.
And that they can no longer be expected to prop up a health system that has almost run out of breath.
It's devastating at times, catastrophic at times.
And the phone will keep ringing out and you're thinking, I wonder what that is, you know, because you can't get to it.
Stacey Butler and Norma Rhodes are nurses who've devoted their entire careers to working in their local hospital in Tenterfield in northwestern New South Wales. But in the last few years, they've found themselves increasingly alone. Unbelievably, often just the two of them were left manning the hospital without a doctor.
I was crying every day, praying that nothing would happen or no one you knew would come in the door.
So you would wake up in the morning fearful of what today would bring?
Absolutely. Here we are. God love Les.
Between them, Norma and Stacey spent more than 40 years working in the hospital. It was a job they loved and a career they cherished. But in recent years, things changed. The hospital's 66 beds were cut back to 13 and staff numbers drastically reduced.
Just because we're in the bush, we still get the same presentations, the same severity. You know, the chest pains, the cardiac arrests, the motor vehicle accidents, the falls, the fractures, and there's 2 of us in the building, and the only 2 in the whole entire building.
Well, we all grew up here, you know. It's our town, our people.
Tenterfield
has a population of 4,000.
It was a huge responsibility. I think they expected a lot of us because they knew us, they know our families.
And the local hospital now relies on medical staff prepared to fly in and out for short periods. I think there have been situations where doctors have come and just walked out.
Yeah, there has, and agency nurses. A lot of them came unaware of I think, what our hospital's actually like, that there is no one, there's no more backup.
With so many visiting doctors and nurses shocked by the situation they find themselves in, country hospitals struggle to attract staff. It often means the only doctor some hospitals see is a virtual doctor, a medical practitioner who can be based anywhere in the world. How many virtual doctors do you have?
We have 20 doctors that we can call upon.
Dr. Shannon Knott believes telehealth is an effective solution. As the Rural Health Director of Medical Services for the Western New South Wales Local Health District, his job is to fill the gaps in the 39 facilities in his area.
We've got a critical care nursing staff and also a logistics officers supporting all of our regions across Western New South Wales, regardless of whether there's a doctor on site or not.
At the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Dubbo, in an upstairs room filled with computers, Dr. Knott oversees the virtual health of scores of rural towns.
Is that what we're hearing these conversations are, to patients and doctors or nurses bedside?
Yeah, so directly to the patient bedside. So our nursing staff will be often working with the individual nurses or doctors on the ground and conference calling them so that we can bring in all of the expertise to wrap around the patient care at any one time.
The important thing is that we've got a treatment for this sort of stroke.
Telehealth has long been used mostly as a complementary service, bringing city specialists to the country.
So the diagnosis is obviously correct. He is having a stroke, and we can see.
But now, for many patients in the bush, a virtual doctor is the only doctor they get to see. Do you believe that virtual doctors will simply take the place of doctors on the ground?
No, I don't. I think doctors on the ground, rural generalists, will continue to play a very vital role in their communities.
But the truth is that virtual doctors are taking the place of doctors on the ground because you have nothing else to offer.
I disagree that they're taking the place of doctors on the ground.
That's happening in hospitals in your own district. They are taking the place of doctors you simply don't have.
Well, what we're doing in our district is continuing to push for doctors across our region. We're working with training doctors.
I know you're pushing for them, but you're
yeah.
not getting them. So virtual doctors are taking the place of doctors on the ground. That's the truth.
I'd still disagree that they're taking the place, because that insinuates that we're taking a doctor out of a community and putting in a virtual doctor. That's not what's happening.
I don't think it's ethically sound. What's concerning me is we've got towns that have had medical presences for, best part of 100 years. Hospitals that have delivered babies, done, minor surgeries. And we're now proposing to treat everybody by telehealth.
Victorian doctor Philip Jolly was a country GP for 25 years and has spent the past 10 years as a locum, helping to fill the gaps at rural hospitals.
You've got to examine someone as part of your assessment. You've got to actually lay the hands on. I'm making an assessment on a patient from the time I call them in from the waiting room, or when I, obviously speak to a nurse and I'm looking at the patient on the trolley. There's all sorts of information you get that you can't get from a telehealth consultation.
And paramedics based in country towns certainly question the ability of virtual doctors to work effectively.
All I can see about virtual doctors is it's a way to save money. They can employ one doctor in some town or other country to sit at a computer and service a number of hospitals rather than paying a doctor to be at each of those hospitals.
Scott Beaton represents the Australian Paramedics Association and has been an intensive care paramedic in Gilgandra in the west of New South Wales for 11 years. He sees firsthand the impact of virtual care.
How can a virtual doctor put stitches into a patient who's fallen over? How can they use a tongue depressor to check someone's tonsils? How can they just assess whether a patient's got a swollen stomach or anything, whether intestinal bleed?
And how does it impact your job?
It impacts my job because we end up on the road transferring these patients to the bigger hospital so they can be seen by a specialist or just another doctor. I know of a case in regional New South Wales where a patient was transported for 2 hours from a small hospital with no doctor to a large hospital just for 3 stitches in a leg.
It often means towns are left to fend for themselves when there's an emergency.
It's exceptionally frustrating. We hear it on the radio on a daily basis. The crews are out on a transfer and they're being asked if there's any available paramedics off duty back in town to go and respond to an elderly lady who's fallen, who could be my grandmother, your grandmother, laying on the floor for an hour waiting for an ambulance.
Coming up, so are you saying that patients are happy with virtual doctors?
We've been able to get really positive experiences.
Who to believe? How do you rate it?
2, if that.
Where are the doctors?
This is Australia, we're not in a third world country.
And why should we all care
The right to health is a human right.
about the country?
We need a dictator who can actually stand up and just say off for their heads.
That's next on 60 Minutes. Rural Australians have long been considered the heart and soul of our nation.
Rivers run, but they stay in one place.
Hard-working and proud people who just get on with it. But many say they feel like second-class citizens.
Everyone should feel let down in rural communities because we're not getting the kind of medical attention that we deserve. Like, everyone deserves to feel safe.
In town after country town across Australia,
it's a bit rough, like just because we're out in the bush, shouldn't be disadvantaged.
You need a doctor.
the story is the same.
Do you feel a bit forgotten?
Yeah, totally.
Health services have been stripped bare, leaving many hospitals relying on frontline nurses and a virtual doctor.
What evidence have you got that virtual doctors are able to operate safely?
So for us, to date, the care provided by our virtual teams has been able to be consistent with face-to-face medical coverage.
Dr Shannon Knott is in charge of virtual care in his health district of Western New South Wales and is pleased with the service it provides.
Oh, so are you saying that patients are happy with virtual doctors?
So from the surveys that we've got in Western New South Wales back from our patients, particularly in those sites where patients have had to experience virtual care because we haven't been able to either get a local doctor on the ground or where we haven't been able to bring in a locum, particularly due to COVID, we've been able to get really positive experiences.
Your experience with the virtual doctor, how do you rate it?
Out of 10, 2, if that.
Gary Owens sought treatment for an extremely painful big toe and his left foot at Golgong Hospital in central Western New South Wales.
I've only got one leg, so obviously the big toe on my left foot is quite important. The nurses looked at it and then they got the virtual doctor, or whatever you want to call it, to have a look, and no matter what they did, the doctor couldn't see properly what was going on. So I finished up going away, and then I rang a friend of mine who's an ex-army nurse. He looked at it, knew what it was straight away, and he fixed it.
What was it?
Ingrown toenail.
Barbara Cease's husband Barry was terminally ill with cancer. As he lay in his bed at Golgong Hospital, taking his final breaths, a virtual doctor was called.
They brought the virtual doctor in to pronounce him dead.
I actually can't imagine what that must have been like. How do you describe that?
Well, appalling. For this is Australia. We're not in a third world country.
From the time I knew my mum was unwell on that Tuesday, it would have been between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, and by 6:30 she had passed away.
When 66-year-old Dawn Trevett was rushed to Golgong Hospital with internal bleeding, her daughter Hayley and stepson Steve barely had time to comprehend what had happened.
I can remember ringing Steve that night and saying, "Mum's gone, like Mum's passed away," and he was like, "What do you mean?"
Hayley and Steve lived several hours from their parents' Golgong home.
It's quite confronting.
Their shock was compounded when a local police officer told them the hospital their mother was rushed to did not have a doctor.
I can remember it so vividly. He was standing in the lounge room of Mum and Dad's house, and sort of a throwaway comment in terms of, because there was no doctor present. And it knocked me. And I remember looking at Steve thinking, sorry, what? Did I just hear no doctor present? And I said, what do you mean there was no doctor present?
We just looked at one another and said, is the community happy with that approach?
Nursing staff desperately struggled to keep Dawn alive.
We could hear everything. We were in the adjoining room.
Local resident Ros Phelps was seeking treatment at the hospital when Dawn was rushed in by paramedics.
Obviously, they were using the telehealth. I could hear the nurses, I could hear the paramedics, and the nurse was actually pleading for somebody to help her.
You could hear a nurse pleading for help.
It was like, please, I need someone to help me. Can't someone help me? I had heard at one stage, one of the paramedics asked, was there more staff on? And they were told no, there was just the two of them. And the paramedic then said, well, who is looking after the rest of the patients? And they said the cook is.
The cook?
The cook.
Did they mean the cook?
Yes, the cook was looking after the rest of the patients.
This one's one of the best ones of you two together, I think.
It's been a traumatic time for the Trevetts, Dawn's husband Rod and her family. who are still coming to terms with her sudden death. Are you haunted by that? That terrible question of what if?
Yes, I am. I would never have thought in my life that I would have to lose my mum under such horrific circumstances, but also have the loss in a situation that I feel like possibly might have been avoided. And I'm never going to know that, and I have to find peace with that.
Before Dawn's death, her community had already started a petition demanding a doctor work at the hospital.
It's amazing how many people have decided to write it down.
Kathy Pearson, Sherelle Fellows and Kitty Eggerking collected thousands of signatures and were overwhelmed by more horror stories.
These are people who need care and they're struggling and they're suffering, and that's...
Yeah. So yes.
Their petition was successful. Golgong Hospital has re-employed its doctor. What's your message to other communities facing the same situation?
My message would be speak up. They need to have their voices heard.
They need to demand a better service.
Yeah, the right to health is a human right. And I think everybody should be able to expect that in a country like Australia.
We deserve as much as our city counterparts.
For nurses Stacey Butler and Norma Rhodes, their life's work at Tenterfield Hospital has come to an end. Both found they could no longer cope with the pressure of being alone while trying to care for their patients. I imagine it's not easy to walk away.
It was the hardest decision of my life. I can't even talk about it without getting upset. It was just the most horrific feeling, walking away and leaving everyone up there. It was terrible.
You know, I watched her come as a new grad, scared little girl, and she, you know, she ended up being one of the best nurses that ever walked through those doors. And to see her like that was just heartbreaking.
So when did you decide that you, too, had to walk away?
Well, there was an incident at work that was my breaking point, where I thought, I just cannot do this anymore.
It is an untenable situation. There are now scores of country hospitals across Australia without doctors and with nursing staff who can barely cope. But rural GP Philip Jolly believes that can change if our nation's leaders are prepared to step up. In your opinion, what will it take to finally fix the health of the system for people in rural regions?
Look, ultimately, we need a dictator who can actually stand up and just say off for their heads, you know, this is what it's going to be. Bottom line is, you can't get doctors to work in these country towns without providing carrots. We have to change the business of doing medicine in country areas, so it is achievable for a solo practitioner to go to a country town, earn enough money to actually be competitive with someone working in metropolitan Australia. It's an opportunity for leadership.
It is an opportunity for leadership.
I implore them to try and help our rural communities.
Hello, I'm Liz Hayes. Thanks for watching. To keep up with the latest from 60 Minutes Australia, make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also download the 9Now app for full episodes and other exclusive 60 Minutes content.